Hello, my name is Lisa Marginelli. I'm the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, a quarterly science policy journal that is a partnership between the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues along with ASU's CSPO, which is the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. And we're really glad that you're here. I'm happy to introduce today's discussion. Is there really a STEM workforce shortage? Right now, there are about 75 of you in the webinar. And I want you to know that you're welcome to introduce yourselves in the chat to each other. And before I introduce the moderator, I want to say a little bit about our general goal for these events. In part, we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way that science and technology and policy interact in the real world. And that's what this question really is about. But such a discussion requires not only experts, but also lots of other people, such as society in general, including yourselves. So the discussion today is about half of it will be a moderated discussion led by Eleanor Mueller here. And then the rest of it is responding to your questions from the audience. So the important thing to realize is that you can chat away in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, put it in the Q&A. You'll see that at the bar at the bottom of the webinar frame. There's a Q&A format there. So put the questions in there, and then we will send them on to Eleanor to ask. So let's get started. Our moderator today is Eleanor Mueller. She's a labor reporter for Politico covering the Hill. Thank you so much for being with us today, Eleanor. I'm going to turn this over to her, and we really look forward to the event.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on the STEM workforce and whether or not there really is a gap between supply and demand. As Lisa mentioned, I cover specifically employment and immigration policy at Politico. So both very relevant topics. This is something that I've written about, something I've spoken to one of our panelists about, and I'm excited to introduce you to all of them. We've got Ron Hira of Howard University, who is the author of the paper that brought us here in the first place. We've got Trevor Wagener of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. We've got Matt Sigelman of the Burning Glass Institutes. And lastly, but not least, Iris Wagstaff of Wagstaff STEM Solutions. As Lisa mentioned, we're going to do about 30 minutes of moderated questions that I am going to be asking. And then we'll switch over to audience questions. So make sure that you submit them using the Q&A, and we'll get to those in the second half of the discussion. To start us off, though, I mean, I'm not going to go through all of what Ron covered in the paper, but you should definitely make sure that you have it up and you've read it if you haven't already. But to start us, Ron, I mean, for some watching, today's conversation might feel a little deja vu. How long has there been this debate over whether or not there is a dearth of STEM workers, and how has it differed recently?
So that's kind of the inspiration. Is this is a recurring kind of issue where there's a perception that there's a STEM workforce shortage, and then when people actually look into it and try to dig through the data, they're not able to find it. So this dates back into the 1950s. George Stigler, Ken Arrow, and William Capron. Back in the 50s, Ken Arrow and Stigler were both Nobel Prize winners. They couldn't find the shortage. So this is coming out of World War II and ramp up. And they couldn't find it within the engineering labor market. And then in the 70s, we saw a recurrence of this. Richard Freeman from Harvard did his dissertation on the cobweb model of engineering employment. There's a really good piece by a book by Michael Teitelbaum called Falling Behind, which I would recommend to everybody here. And Michael goes through the whole sort of history of the discussion around STEM workforce shortages and how people have tried to analyze it and not been able to find those kind of shortages. And more recently, work by a co-collaborator of mine, Hal Saltzman. So I'm not alone in sort of looking at these kinds of things, but I thought it was time right now, especially to kind of have a reset and have a little bit more balanced discussion, because we've got the CHIPS Act that just passed. There's a lot of discussion about STEM workforce shortages. We've had a boom in the stock market, which may be pulling back a little bit. And so those are the times where you want to be having a more balanced discussion about supply and demand.
And what exactly was the impetus for this paper specifically? I mean, what did you think was lacking from the conversation that needed to be surfaced?
Yeah, so, I've been around Washington circles, and I've been working on these kinds of issues for an employment policy for 25 years, particularly on the high skill side of things. There's always these sort of pushes. Sometimes it's political around immigration policy, for example, which is an area I work on, and you'll see these pushes in cycles for more workers, that there's a dearth of engineers and computer scientists. So part of it was that, and part of it is just there's people forget there's an issue attention attention cycle, a life cycle, as Anthony Downs would talk about, where the public and the elite policymaking group really forget about things. Like, I think Teitelbaum's book was written back in 2014. So every so often we have to kind of refresh this. And in part, it's because our institutions that vet policy ideas and should be separating the signal from the noise don't do a very good job. And I talk a little bit about this in the paper, but I think Chris Griswold hit it from American Compass, hit it in one of his forum responses, that where you stand on this issue depends on where you sit. And so you get sort of an echo chamber and amplification of sort of one side, that there's always a shortage. And so I felt like we needed that kind of reset at this time.
So a lot of what Ron lays out so well in this paper is how to look at the data surrounding STEM workforces. And as part of that, not just the numbers that we do have, but also the numbers that we don't have. And so my next question is for Matt. It's difficult, of course, to solve a problem if you don't know exactly what the boundaries of that problem are. How exactly is a lack of data complicating the debate over, the gap between supply and demand of STEM workers?
Yeah, I was really appreciative to Ron for laying out that that lack of awareness, lack of data. There's because I think at a broad macro level, in fact, a lot of things do seem to balance out much more than is the experience in the field. And I think part of what has historically impeded us from getting to the bottom of this is lack of really effective micro data. There's no single kind of talent, and therefore no single kind of shortage. And a lot of, when you unpack it, a lot of what you start to see is specific fields that have very different ratios of employed workers to posting demand, for example. You see fields that have very different pipelines of talent, of new talent in the market in terms of current enrollments and recent conferrals. For example, in the engineering disciplines, computer science is sort of the pothole that ate STEM. With most of the growth in STEM enrollment over the last 50 years. You look at the IPEDS database coming into CS and leaving most of the other engineering disciplines pretty flat. We know that even more micro than that, in the same fields, skills change very fast. From some of our recent research, we found that the average U.S. job has seen about 37% of its skills, of its top skills, replaced just over the last 5 years. Unless you can track that, you may not see some of the imbalances happening at the skill level. And that's especially true because a lot of the kind of disruption that's happening in skills today is being driven by disruptive technologies on one side, being driven by growing competition for STEM skills outside of STEM disciplines that now increasingly need STEM skills, So, we've been focused on mining what are often called real-time labor data sources. I think it's actually kind of a misnomer. I mean, they are real-time, but I think the real value of them is the ability to get much more granular about the kind of signals that are being sent, both from the perspective of demand, what are employers looking for, and supply, what are the skills that that workers are accruing, are signaling, and where are the mismatches there.
Interesting. Iris, you also penned a response to Ron's paper, and you point out that a lot of the narrative around the STEM workforce doesn't always include the people who make it up. So why do you think it's so important to give career STEM workers a larger voice in this discussion? And do you have ideas on how to do so?
Sure, and I just also I really appreciated Ron's work and also agree with the comments by Matt. But yeah, so I wear a number of roles and different hats. I'm a research chemist. I'm also a STEM education researcher and social scientist. I work with and mentor a lot of undergraduate and graduate students, as well as early career STEM professionals. So from my perspective, from my vast diverse network, I don't see a shortage, right? I do know that, and again, it depends on, as Matt said, when you disaggregate the data and break it down across sectors, even within sectors, for example, with engineering, or let's just look at women in the sciences. So women are well represented in the life sciences and the social sciences, but not in the physical sciences, which is my discipline. Even if you look at the forensic sciences, women and underrepresented minorities are well represented in the forensic sciences. So, workforce trends are not static, they're dynamic. And again, I really think it depends on your positionality. One thing I like to mention is that I get asked a lot. I sit on a lot of federal grant review panels. I advise different types of organizations, and I'm, always, told, well, we're having difficulty finding people from diverse backgrounds in specific STEM disciplines. And I can easily make some phone calls and put a call out and, fulfill that need just from my network. So I think awareness is one issue. I think recruiting and outreach is another issue that's definitely low-hanging fruit. But I think a lot of this comes down to really, making relationships and developing networks and, being purposeful about relationships, particularly to engage underrepresented minorities in STEM.
Definitely. Trevor, you, of course, are joining us from the Computer and Communications Industry Association. The tech industry, it goes without saying, is one of the largest voices when it comes to a need for more STEM workers, as well as immigration reform as potentially, the most fitting policy solution. What is your response to what Ron said about how your view of this depends on where you sit? You know what I mean? Like, how does the tech industry grapple with this idea that, some of the claims that they've been making might not always match up with the data?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad to be here. And I very much like how Ron framed some of the issues that he was raising, because I think they get at a fundamental disconnect that often occurs in the discourse when talking about these issues. High-skilled immigration is just one part of sort of an all-of-the-above approach that the tech industry needs in order to maintain American leadership in tech worldwide. It has never been more competitive. America faces many, many competitors globally. American firms face many, many competitors globally. And in order to maintain American leadership in tech, it's very important that we have the best tech talent in the world in the United States of America. And as much as possible, we want that to be homegrown. And that's one reason why having some of the best colleges and universities, as well as a number of alternative programs that avoid the high costs and potential barriers to more diverse employment created by certain four-year degree programs, for example, are so useful. And the tech industry really has been looking at those as ways to make sure that we are expanding and making sure that we're getting as much talent as we can domestically. At the same time, it's also very important to recognize that the United States has about 5% of the world's population. And if we're going to be the leader in tech, we're going to want to make sure that we have the most talented workforce in the world in the United States of America. And as part of that all of the above approach, we want to make sure that the best minds in tech, the best programmers, the best engineers, what have you, can all come to the United States of America alongside our best domestic talent in order to ensure continuing leadership. I also think there is one high-level point that is often glossed over, and that is that we're not talking about a static situation. Tech is very dynamic. The situation today is not what the situation was 3 or 4 years ago. And that's very apparent when you look at particular subsectors of the economy. How tech will look in 5 years will be very different from how it looks today. It's a growing pie, and it's a pie that we want to grow further. And when you get the best minds here with better education, better alternatives to just 4-year degree programs, as well as getting the best minds from abroad to come to the United States, they don't just work for existing American companies. They found new companies and create new employment opportunities within the country that benefit US-born workers as well. So we really do view this as a dynamic process that results in many, many more jobs in the United States from making sure that we have as much talent as possible in the United States. And that dynamic approach, that sort of growing pie, rising tide lifts all ships, is sort of the approach that the industry takes to getting high-skilled labor in the United States, both domestically and abroad.
Ron, do you have what's your response to that? And anyone else should feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, so I'd say a couple of things. I think it's fascinating that so much of the focus was on immigration in discussion, and I think that that's true from industry. That seems to be like, the old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so this becomes problematic, and there's a lot in the sort of terminology around best. And really the key issue around high-skill immigration policy, and I've been involved in discussing this before Congress, testifying and whatnot, is setting what do we mean by best and treating temporary workers fairly, right? The H-1B program really is much more about cheap labor and indentured servitude than it is about bringing in the best. So I think we have to be careful and separate out within the immigration discussion about that. This idea of if we just have more supply, it's always going to create more and more demand, I think is a very simple and maybe too simplistic a way to look at what the labor market dynamics are. That's assuming that everybody is complementary to everybody else in the economic terms, as opposed to that there is some substitutability that goes on. If you're going to increase supply, there is competition that's created by more supply. This is labor market dynamics. It's complicated, but there's definitely some substitution. There is competition. Not everybody that's being brought in either abroad or even entering the market is necessarily complementary. If things were so great, we would see wages increase significantly. We wouldn't see engineering employment be extremely flat for years and years, and even projected out to be flat. You wouldn't have seen, the semiconductor industry offshored, more than half of its workforce 20 years ago, and now is saying that there are shortages. What happened to those 400,000 semiconductor workers who were in that industry? They lost their jobs. They had to go get absorbed somewhere else. So I think these, we have to be really a little bit more careful about the terminology we use, like best and competitive and leader. We have to look at a balanced approach. What's good for the companies sometimes is good for the country, and sometimes it's good for the workers, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's actually bad for the workers. And so that's where I think there's an imbalance. It makes sense somebody representing the industry would make these arguments, but policymakers, unfortunately, and policy institutions that are supposed to be vetting these policy ideas make these same arguments, in part because we don't have someone, as Iris talked about, representing sort of U.S. workers, students in the conversation, and you don't have those policy institutions sort of vetting all of this terminology. It sort of gets capturing the narrative, so to speak.
Speaking of compensation, something I thought that you pointed out, Matt, in your response that I thought was fascinating is the fact that STEM has a very high attrition rate, which I personally had not previously known. And as you write, there's no real experience premium that comes with being in the field for an extended period of time. How does that make the conversation that we're having around a STEM workforce different than when we might be talking about other kinds of workers?
So I think this is a place, this goes back to some of what I was sharing before about the dynamism of skills within the STEM economy. That dynamism I described before is across all careers, but it is particularly strong in corners of the tech market. And I think Ron is correct that we can't speak in blanket ways about the STEM economy. There's some parts of it which are more dynamic than others. There's some parts of it where, there's greater elasticity of demand than others. And I think it's important to be able to mark those out. But there are certain parts of, if you look at, for example, the jobs that have the highest rate of skill disruption, where the most skills are being replaced, almost all of them are STEM jobs. And there are many of them where literally 70-80% of skills are replaced. So when you see that kind of level of dynamism, what you find, and I think David Deming at Harvard was, I think did some great research on this, is that there's just not a way to be able to get a premium for your experience in the field. Essentially, STEM workers are renting out their skills. So when you first graduate, they're high premium, high value skills in a lot of cases. STEM grads overall get, I think, about a 40-45% premium over non-STEM grads when they first come out of school. By the end of their first decade out of education, that's down to about 10 or 11%. And what David found was that a lot of that was because, they've got these skills, the skills obsolete. And so workers have to just keep acquiring new skills for which they don't necessarily have that much of a premium. And so people wind up leaving STEM disciplines as a means of getting ahead.
Interesting. Iris, we're getting some comments on the chat, and this is actually my last question that I had for you, but you touched on this a little bit before, but I want to come back. How does a lack of data on the untapped STEM talent, so specifically, Black and Indigenous people of color and workers with disabilities, impact their ability to enter the field and to thrive once they're there? And how do we best address that?
Yeah, it's a huge issue as a woman of color in STEM, in chemistry, in a physical science. I do want to touch on the last point before I answer this question, though. The attrition rate is key, and it's not discussed enough. I've actually worked in all four sectors. I started out in the chemical industry and transitioned to research and policy in academia, and it's a huge issue, and people don't think that in the STEM field there's an attrition rate, especially when you talk to women and women of color, specifically like in engineering, and those areas leave at high rates because of a number of issues, just hostile climates, just the atmosphere. So when you talk about talent, I think we just really, again, like as Ron said, need to be really careful about the talent that we're discounting, all the way starting through elementary, right? The students, particularly underrepresented minorities, who don't get selected for the internships because skills have to be developed and built. And so when you discount students, even if we're still using a pipeline metaphor, a lot of those students are discounted early on and leave at different trajectories along that pathway and that pipeline. So I think it's really, really critical to think about the intersectionalities, all the different ways that we miss engaging all of our human capital, particularly students from diverse backgrounds. And it really goes back to elementary, right? So creating access to quality STEM education, basic quality STEM education, having quality STEM teachers, all of those factor in to positioning students to even be able to see college as an option, or even to be prepared for college and the workforce. I think, again, some of the things that we can do is really support professional development of teachers, support teachers from diverse backgrounds. That's not the case, especially at those critical transitions between elementary and middle school and high school. A lot of the organizations that approach me just for basic things like outreach and recruiting are not even aware of a number of the professional societies that really support underrepresented minorities in STEM. I'm a 30-year member of the American Chemical Society, but I'm also a 30-year member of the National Organization of Black Chemists and Chemical Engineers, or NOVASHE. But if you're an organization that's not even aware of all of these organizations that support underrepresented minorities in STEM, then there's a lot to do. And I think a lot of this is just kind of low-hanging fruit. So, outreach and recruitment, to me, that's low-hanging fruit. What really takes the work is being intentional and purposeful about developing relationships, right? So when you need talent to already be in the pipeline, you've already had those relationships developed. So there's a lot of things I could talk for the next hour about, things that could be done, but just organizations really, devoting the time, the effort, the energy, the staff, the dollars to be intentional and thoughtful about, not just, recruiting and sharing opportunities to diverse networks, but really, creating those relationships and sustaining those relationships because it's needed.
I'm glad.
Eleanor, can I just quickly add to Iris's point here? Because I think one of the things which we think about where there may be gaps, or if we believe there are, and there's not necessarily complete alignment across us on that, but what might be driving them is questions of artificial constraints. And I think Iris hit the nail on the head there. I think we've increasingly been coming to look at, to take a broader lens to understanding our STEM workforce, to understand that it's not just scientists and engineers, but a range of technicians. The NSF has recently come up with a broader definition of STEM-related fields and the like. But the STEM field in general is one that is doing a lot of tripping on its own shoelaces in terms of providing access to STEM jobs. While the rest of the markets, there's been a lot of embraced by employers of partly for equity issues, partly for talent shortage reasons, of skills-based hiring, that is hiring based on the skills someone has as opposed to the degree they have. Overall, over the last 10 years, over 20% reduction in the percentage of postings that require a degree. In STEM, it's gone the exact opposite. During that same period of time, we've seen the percentage of STEM jobs that require a degree grow by 17%. And so if we're going to talk about a shortage, we need to think about, are there ways that we can build the kind of pathways Iris just described to bring people into STEM, to bring people up from within STEM, from places where there may be greater availability of talent, where there may be greater representation, to the kinds of parts of the workforce where employers report shortage. And as we think about now having this kind of air quotes professional STEM workforce and then STEM technicians, and recognizing that it's all part of STEM, I sometimes like to use the military analogy. It's like we've got officers, we've got a Corps of enlisted service members, and we've got no officers candidates goal to move them between from one to the other.
Ron, go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to connect both Iris and Matt's comments. So Matt lays out what I think is a really interesting puzzle, which is his claim is that there are these skills that are moving so fast that nobody really can keep up with it if you're already in the workforce. But somehow people who are newly graduating are able to have these new skills, even though they're taught by professors who've been presumably pretty old, so that the incumbent workers really don't have a way of acquiring these skills. We've been hearing about this for a very long time. The age earnings profile that Matt's referencing with Deming's work, that's been going on since I graduated from engineering college, which is back in the 1980s, where you start out with a high wage premium and then everybody else catches up because you don't get as many raises. So I think there's a little bit more complexity there. You've got this sort of notion of a high frequency, skills change demand, and then you've got the sort of low frequency that you've got a frequency mismatch in terms of education and workforce development. And you've got this gap, and we've had this supposed gap for decades, but we haven't been able to define it or examine why there's the market failure and a persistent market failure. But I want to take a step back, which ties into both what Iris and Matt talked about later, which is this is often framed as a skills gap. Right? You'll hear that term. The shortage isn't really a shortage in numbers, it's a skills gap. And when we think about words really matter, and when we think about a skills gap, it trains your eye, it trains your focus on the supply side of saying that the workers are deficient in some way because there's this demand out there and the workers just have no way, and the education system has no way of keeping up with it. Instead, if we called it, let's say, an expectations gap, that the expectations of employers may be in terms of what skills they're looking for, how much they're willing to invest, how much time they're willing to wait to develop workers and invest in workers. Maybe the expectations gap is too large, or maybe we call it a recruitment gap, that these employers are actually not going out, as Iris talked about, going out to the places where there is talent, and that they could go find talent if they chose to, but they're not making that recruitment effort. They're not raising wages. They're not, as Matt was talking about, over specifying, over credentializing their position descriptions. So I think we need sort of a reframing and thinking about this. This is a market transaction. There are multiple players here. If we're only focused on workers and their deficiencies, I think we're missing the opportunity to bridge that gap.
Trevor, yeah, please.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear from you. I mean, what you think about these things that employers can bring to the table on the demand side.
Certainly. So one thing I want to just sort of connect back with what Matt and Iris were saying earlier. I think it's very important to note that it's not about any sort of a deficiency in the supply side per se. It's simply about the fact that employers are facing real competitive pressures. And those competitive pressures mean that they have a position to fill that they need to fill quickly. And if they can't fill it quickly, they risk falling behind. And once you fall behind, it can be the case that you are no longer the leader in that field or in that niche. And that is not a position that employers want to be in. They want to hire as quickly as they can. And they need flexibility in order to hire as quickly as they can. Now, part of flexibility has been an increasing recognition from the tech industry that when you rely upon four-year degree programs exclusively or almost exclusively, you're missing out on a huge pool of potential talent. And this is an area that tech employers have been very aware of and have been working to get around, because it's very possible that someone has the relevant skills if they can pass, relevant coding certification programs and can pass practical hands-on tests for employment, that they may be able to fill roles. And the tech industry has been very good about trying to focus on bringing up such talent to the extent that they can. A major problem on sort of the broader societal spectrum is that there aren't as many of these programs that have a long track record. Therefore, you need a lot of specific tests that employers have to run to make sure that employees are able to perform at the level that they're expecting. And that requires a lot of extra effort to recruit, which many tech employers have been putting in. At the same time, though, it can be the case that even with an alternative program that doesn't require a four-year degree or a master's degree even, that if you need someone within the next year or so, it's going to take time for that pipeline to fill up. And you're going to need to have the flexibility to hire someone to fill that role in the meantime so that you can stay competitive and can maintain your leadership and broadly American leadership in tech. So flexibility really is the key word that I think is most important here. It's not about a deficiency, it's about a fast-moving market. And fast-moving markets require flexibility. And tech employers recognize that, and they are responding in kind.
Obviously, there's another stakeholder here other than the workers and the employers, and that's higher education. And that's also our first audience question. Someone wants to know, can the panelists speak to higher education roles as suppliers in this conversation? And how can that be used to get underneath some of these forces that are perpetuating disparities? Happy to throw to whoever feels comfortable answering that first, and everyone else can gather their thoughts. Any volunteers?
Glad to start here. I think this is where, and actually I have some mixed feelings about the flexibility point, but I would reframe that as agility. Flexibility to me, by the way, and just to sort of lay it out, I think the concern I have with the point about asking for flexibility, and this is where I will agree with Ron, I think we've got I think this is where you wind up with employers sort of saying, hey, I want to be able to hire and fire at will, and I also want to be able to have the skills I need when I need them, without the need to invest in workforce over time. But agility, I think, is something that carries throughout the market and could be an enabler for the entire market. Right now, our main way of training people into STEM fields is through traditional degree programs at higher education institutions. To Ron's point, I brought up the point about skills change very fast. Curriculum doesn't. Curriculum doesn't, not only because for all the worn metaphors or accusations people like to lobby at higher education, but more actually specifically by design. Accreditation reviews don't allow more than a certain percentage of curriculum to change over the space of the 5 to 7 years between reviews. But for us to be able to facilitate workers, STEM workers, in acquiring new skills, for us to be able to help people move into STEM and to participate in the growth of the STEM economy, we need to be able to launch programs much faster in ways that are both more predictive and more responsive than they've been, and that don't necessarily involve degrees. And it's sort of interesting right now. We're in a higher education spectrum or higher education conversation where there's been overall a significant decline in enrollments over certainly since the pandemic, but for demographic reasons since before. And at the same time that universities are increasingly clawing at each other for a growing share of a shrinking market, there's a broad community of learners who could benefit from the ability to acquire skills in a more agile way, and thereby to be the pipeline of demand that the market needs.
Ron, what about you? Any thoughts on how higher education can do better when it comes to this workforce, the STEM workforce?
Yeah, I think, one of the reasons also I wrote the paper is that almost no one talks about the fact that we have record number of STEM graduates and STEM enrollment. I mean, engineering enrollment and degrees is way through the roof. I mean, record by large percentage numbers. So that tells me that, and at the bachelor's level, it's almost all U.S. citizens and permanent residents. So that tells me that, we're very defeatist and pessimistic about U.S. students and U.S. workers, but they're both interested in these areas and they're capable of doing these jobs. Now, my concern about what Matt describes in terms of these very fast changing skills is that's a challenge, right? Because are these skills perishable? What's their shelf life? And from an individual point of view, if I'm investing, if we're going to go back to Gary Becker and human capital, if I'm going to think about investing in my own education from a job perspective, am I going to get a return on investment if those skills are very perishable? And those skills are not just, going to benefit me in wages. Some company that Trevor represents is profiting from that. So where do we bridge this in terms of of training those skills? And why wouldn't you do that with incumbent workers rather than go back and look at the 4-year degree folks in higher education? So I think there's really important issues that Matt's bringing up. These things have been around for a long time. These areas and gaps have been raised in the past, not as carefully as Matt has done recently with his new data, but we don't have answers. And you got to wonder, where are the policy institutions? What have they been doing for the last 25 years as we've talked about this?
And important, by the way, just to distinguish between how we acquire things and who pays for it. I think, Ron raised important questions about the fact that it's not fair to ask workers to bear all of this cost on their own, or frankly, for them to have to know what skills to navigate themselves to. There's no infrastructure for helping people know what skills or what career avenues may be open to them. But the broad need for people in a very dynamic market, and precisely because skills are very perishable, is all the more reason why the infrastructure for skill development needs to be there. We live in a market right now, which is, and this is the ugly underbelly of labor flexibility. What people call the Great Resignation is really just the extension of a highly casual work relationship labor market, which is in a seller's market. But either way, we have very fleeting relationships between employers and employees, and that's driven at least as much by employers as by employees. In that context, there is a significant free rider problem that employers face of okay, why should I train you up if you're going to leave me in 12 months?
So very quick point here, as much talk there is about Great Resignation, we haven't seen employers actually do things to try to tether their employees in a positive way. A generation ago, we had defined benefit pension programs. You don't see any of those companies complaining about the Great Resignation going from their 401k back to defined benefit plans. So, I think that we just have to be careful about looking at actual behavior when we look at these market dynamics. And then in terms of lifelong learning and this idea that, we're going to do this, that lifelong learning idea came from Bob Reich and the Clinton administration. There was $1,000 tax credit. Has anybody revisited that?
Iris, I'm wondering if you can speak. I mean, higher education, at least to me, as someone who's spoken to a few people, but definitely don't know as much as you for. How is higher education uniquely positioned to help address some of these disparities specifically in the workforce and pull in people that otherwise may not have been?
Yeah, higher education plays a critical role. I hope everyone can hear me okay, especially at the undergraduate level, because undergraduate STEM faculty act as gatekeepers, especially in math. So we hear from students all the time, especially first generation students like myself that may come from low income backgrounds. Low income is not always a proxy for minority or students coming from. There are all types of indicators of diversity, but yeah, definitely undergraduate faculty act as gatekeepers. And I think we haven't even, touched on all of the transformational movements over the last 10 years in K-12 education with respect to science, specifically with the next generation science standards and the National Research Council K-12 framework on science education. So those have been transformative efforts, but when these students graduate from high school, they're going into undergraduate STEM departments that have not changed, as a number of you have mentioned, in the last 20 years, right? So there are some pedagogical changes like inquiry-based learning and, teaching from a real world, relevant perspective, but largely pretty much STEM departments have not changed. And I think we need to, speak from a systems thinking approach. And again, as Ron says, not from a deficit approach. Like when you have these students with immense potential and opportunity, entering these undergraduate STEM departments, and they're met with hostile environments, and they don't feel welcome, they don't feel assured, they don't feel reassured, right? So there are a lot of factors that go into that. And I think it goes to, much something beyond professional development, right, of STEM faculty. It has to be a top-down commitment from leadership, from administration, especially, again, if you want to engage all of our capital. People from diverse backgrounds have, are fruitful opportunities for the country, even beyond diversity. But, when you talk about diversity without inclusion and without equity doesn't work, right? So when you're, even if you have more numbers or more students from, underrepresented backgrounds or diverse backgrounds entering to these hostile environments in these undergraduate STEM departments, you have a retention issue. So I think, diversity and equity and inclusion, it all goes together. I think, again, as Ron said, we have to move away from a deficit approach. And actually, when you look at overall numbers of STEM degrees attained, it's very strong, as Ron said. So we're not lacking in graduating students in STEM degrees, but when you hear from industry, those students who are newly graduated don't have a lot of the specific skills that align with the workforce. And I think at the community college level, they've done a lot better than four-year institutions because they actually align with workforce needs and skills that local and regional companies actually need. So I think, community colleges are, not considered, premier talent. And I think community colleges offer a lot of potential, especially even if they don't transfer to a four-year institution. I think community colleges have a great model with what we've seen over the last 5 years with articulation agreements with companies and regional industries, but really aligning with what with what the workforce needs. So I think, higher ed faculty, administration, leadership definitely play a critical role in really, just changing the environment instead of changing the student or thinking the problem is with the student. Again, talent, skills have to be cultivated and developed. So I think, again, diversity without equity and inclusion and opportunity and being really intentional and thoughtful about that, they all go hand in hand.
Well, I'm really glad that you brought up community colleges because we actually got another related question that I want to give to you, Trevor. Do we have any good examples of employers who have engaged in meaningful ways with higher education institutions that are not four-year colleges? So, for example, either two-year programs or community colleges or things like that.
Certainly. So a large number of the leading tech companies, and actually tech companies of all size, have in the past few years really tried to expand their efforts to recruit from not just four-year degree granting institutions. And this is in recognition of points that I know I've seen in some of Matt's writing, for example, that there are a number of skill sets that are, able to be attained in a shorter amount of time that can, in fact, help us to build more talent domestically. And many tech companies have supported such programs and tried to recruit from them to a much greater degree. And this also includes, of course, community colleges, because as Iris pointed out, community colleges are able to be a bit more agile just because of their design. It doesn't take 4 years. They have different sort of institutional factors at play that make it a little bit easier to respond to workforce needs. And tech employers recognize this, and they have responded in a significant way by trying to support such programs and focus more of their recruiting on such programs. Obviously, it's still a work in progress. And this is something that I think everyone recognizes, that we need to build more skills, more of these relevant skills, and we need to do so faster because sometimes, a 4-year degree means that you have to wait a rather long time to develop the skill set needed. Those are still very important skills, and I don't see 4-year degree graduates not being competitive in the future at tech companies. There's an increasing recognition that 2-year programs and even certificate programs may be a good place to recruit from. One other point I did just want to point back to is that I do worry that there is sort of an overemphasis on the substitutability element that gets brought up sometimes, because there really is growing the pie as the core desire. I think everyone believes that there will be more tech jobs in the future and more STEM jobs, not fewer. And it's really a matter of how many more will there be here in the United States. And we want to build as many as we can, and having the best talent force that we possibly can, which includes growing the most domestic talent that we possibly can. That's an undeniable core aspect. If we don't do that, we won't be the leader worldwide. That just won't be possible. But if we do that, and we draw some of the best talent from abroad, you put that together, you can ensure that there will be more and more of these roles in the future. One other big point that I do just want to raise, the fast-moving nature, and I do like the term agile that Matt pointed out. It's a good term to describe it. Employers need to be agile, and tech workers also need to be agile. And one way to encourage agility is by having more programs available that don't require 4 years or 2 years or a PhD in order to compete. And this is definitely an area that we've seen a great deal of emphasis. And there are a lot of programs, some at the state level, some locally, some nationwide, to build out more of these programs. And I'm very excited to see what some of these programs will do to really sort of establish themselves as major players for continuing education and growing skill sets to ensure that our workforce remains the most competitive globally.
We are coming up on about T-minus 10 minutes. And so I'm going to ask everyone our final question, the $1 million question. I think Ron had a really good point earlier when he said that what's best for the company might not always be best for the worker, might not always be best for the US. And so my question to you four is, what is the path forward that, is the best case scenario for all three of those interests? From your perspective, what needs to change, and what should makers and other decision makers prioritize in order to best balance all of those competing interests? And Ron, we'll go ahead and we'll start with you.
Okay, so this is a very difficult one, and the reason is I think most people in Washington still haven't figured out that there is a big disconnect between the company's interest and the country's interest. I think we're starting to see a little shift in some of the politics and policy discussions around this. But that separation between company and country and company and worker is something I've been writing about for a very long time. How do you repair that? I'm not sure you can in the financialized world that we've got. If you're the CEO of Microsoft, you're going to be driven by profits. And if that's bad for US workers because you're going to go offshore work, you're going to hire a lot of contract workers instead of permanent workers, you're going to decide to disinvest in workforce development, you're going to replace your US workers or prefer H-1B indentured servants over US workers, you're going to do all of those things. That's normal. We should expect Microsoft to do that. And in addition, because of the political system that we've got, they're going to lobby very hard and use terms like competitive and best talent, and we need all of these kinds of things. What we need is for policymakers to understand that sometimes what's good for Microsoft is aligned with the interests of the country and the workers. And I think this idea of what's good for the workforce should be more in the minds of policymakers than what's good for the employers, in part because a lot of these large employers are actually, much of their stock, much of the equity is owned by foreign investors anyway. And so if you're just trying to juice up stock prices as the way of measuring the health of the country, I think that's a bad move. How do you do that? You do that by creating the infrastructure that Matt talked about, which is how do we create a sort of a virtuous cycle where companies have an incentive, either carrots or sticks, to invest in workers, to build up their productivity, to build up their skills, to meet those kinds of skills that Matt's talking about. And simply going to a flexible labor market is not the way to do that. In fact, that's the way to disinvest in workers, to get better signals, as Matt's talking about. But that's that we have to sort of take a step back and say, what is the actual problem that we're looking at? And I think the CHIPS Act points to this very well. Look at what the CHIPS Act is. You know that they're going to invest in these fabs. These fabs are not like new things. We know what the workforce needs are for each of those fabs, right? Intel is famously known for copy exactly. When it builds a new factory, it copies everything exactly. So you're going to know what kind of bachelor's degree workers you're going to need, which is most of them, and technicians you're going to need. Why can't we plan through that and set up earn and learn programs, right? Co-op programs where people are immediately going to work for Intel, but also then learning at the community colleges or the universities. Instead, what you're hearing on the political front is Intel just wants to import more and more workers rather than training the workforce here in the US. And I think we need that sort of fundamental reset. There's times when you need to import workers, but there's also times when you need to repair this sort of that symbiotic relationship between workers, the country, and employers. And government's got to step in because the market's not going to do it itself.
Matt, we'll go to you next. What does the path forward look like that best balances all of these, occasionally competing interests?
So, look, we often talk about our economic growth strategy. Increasingly, we're talking about, on both sides of the aisle, a national competitiveness strategy. But what we ignore in that is understanding what's the talent strategy that underlies that. What is the talent that is needed for, if we're going to say there's a certain set of sectoral priorities, what's the talent roadmap that's needed? And then what we need to do is further focus that in on a set of jobs that matter. What do I mean by jobs that matter? They're jobs that hit the trifecta of being high value and high mobility to workers, jobs that actually lead to people achieving significant upward economic mobility. Second, jobs that are a pinch point to industry. And third, that are strategically important to a sector, to a region, to the country. And from there, what we can do, if you understand, we all kind of identify those sets of jobs that deliver value to all of the above, then we can say, where can we find that talent? Where are talent pools that are underleveraged, overrepresented? How do we build on the skills that those workers have, the considerable skill base they have, and identify the very specific training paths that will enable them to access that opportunity, so that we're able to have a true model of inclusive growth. And then how do we make sure, to Ron's point, that we've got the infrastructure of visibility to make sure that all workers can see where these opportunities are, can navigate to where they are, that employers can actually see the talent that they're missing today, and create the right both incentives and measures of questions of mobility, measures of questions of competitiveness as well.
Iris, what about you from your perspective? I mean, what does the ideal path forward look like?
Well, I'll try to be brief. I'll try to be brief, but I think the path moving forward is multi-pronged, is multifaceted. The challenges are different at different stages. Even within the K-12 level, the challenges are different as you go from elementary to middle school to high school to college, and preparing students from careers. But I mean, I'm from a small town in Goldsboro, North Carolina, rural Eastern North Carolina, the daughter of a divorced single mom, low income, first generation student. So I'm joining this discussion in spite of, right? So in spite of many, many challenges. I had a few things that worked for me, which was a mom who was devoted to education and opportunity and access and exposure. She had to fight to even get me into the classes that I should have, high level classes that I should have been in at all levels, even starting with elementary, even through middle school and high school. If you're not taking Algebra 1 by 8th grade, you're already off track and not even on path to be considered for a STEM degree. So I think there's just many, there's many junctures, different parts of the solution. I really think it just goes back to maybe some philosophical questions like, what's the purpose of science? What's the purpose of education? I mean, at the end of the day, we really want a scientifically literate, diverse workforce who are engaged citizens, in society, right? So we really want citizenship. We want participation in society. So we want some level of scientific literacy for all Americans. Do I think that it's critical to have a strong STEM workforce? Yes, we all know that that's important. for U.S. to maintain this global competitiveness. But I think it really, a lot of this just goes back to access to quality education in general, and then definitely quality science education. And thinking about all the students who are discounted, like I could have easily been, you know, who's not in this discussion? Who are the students who are not being identified? And then who are the students who are not being selected to, you know, even be made aware of opportunities? So I think there are some very practical things and low-hanging fruit that industries and academic institutions can do, like internships and scholarships and fellowships. You know, really thinking about all types of students. We haven't even talked about students in STEM with disabilities or differently able students. So just really thinking about all the different factors of diversity or students that we're not even considering, who don't even get identified or recruited to even, you know, go through this pipeline to even be prepared for entering college and the STEM workforce. So I just think we just really need to think about some fundamental issues as well as some practical things about just the goal of education and the goal of science and creating real opportunities, because we have some critical problems to address, and we need to engage all of our human capital.
Last but not least, Trevor, anything from your perspective? I mean, what is the best solution here that employers would be happy with?
Certainly. So from the industry perspective, all of the above is sort of the solution that we like best, in the sense that we want to continue improving America's education system. We want more options to building the relevant skills. Because making sure that we're not just fixated on only the four-year degree program is very important. The four-year degree programs create certain barriers. You know, certain schools get recruited from more often, and that can become problematic. We want to make sure that there's recruitment across the board domestically, and skills need to be built domestically through a multitude of paths. And different certificate programs, community colleges, we think these are definitely a path forward to improving skill growth, especially to a broader array of Americans who may not, you know, perhaps for whatever reason, you know, they weren't thinking of a four-year degree, but they do want to learn to program and they have the relevant underlying skills. They just need a program that is right for them. That sort of flexibility is very essential for making sure that we get more Americans, you know, building the right skills to be STEM workers and tech workers. At the same time, I do think that it's important to recognize that it's not a negative sum game or a zero sum game, it's a positive sum game. There are an enormous number of studies that show that whenever you have someone build a certain set of skills, whether it's domestically or coming from abroad, there are multiplier effects from them building those skills. You know, it grows the pie for everyone. The most conservative estimate I've seen is about 1.8 other jobs created across the United States from someone developing those skills in the United States, whether it's an American or whether it is a foreign worker coming to the United States. From our perspective, we want to have more people in the United States with those skills, because that keeps us in the lead. And it also means that we're building a better and stronger America with more jobs across the board for Americans. So that sort of positive sum perspective is really our perspective. We want to see growth. We want to see more people building these skills, and we want to see more people founding new companies here in the United States, that those jobs are located here. And the growth effects are here, benefiting people here. And that can include many, many, many people from the United States and the best talent from around the world coming here too. We view it as a positive sum game, and you know, we're in the lead right now. Do I think we'll still be in the lead in a decade? We're pretty optimistic, but we want to make sure that we stay in the lead. And that means taking that positive sum growth mindset.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. It's been a great conversation. Again, if you have not read Ron's paper or the responses to it, those links are in the chat. They're also, I think, listed with the event. So make sure that you do so, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, Eleanor, for leading this. And many, many thanks to Ron Hira, Iris Wagstaff, Matt Sigelman, and Trevor Wagener for participating. This was a really interesting conversation. I mean, it starts out as a potential look at numbers and at statistics, And it ends up being a conversation about lenses, about how you look at these problems and how you frame them, whether they're seen as a deficit or a mismatch, whether we're talking about frequency of time or location. Excuse me. It's also about, as Ira said, it's about what is the purpose of science? I mean, these are very juicy, important questions for us to grapple with. And if you like this kind of conversation, you're in the right place. Please come back and join us at Issues. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology, www.issues.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter to hear about other discussions. In fact, we have another one next November 1st, just a week from tomorrow. We have another conversation on how the promises of the CHIPS Act can be fulfilled with an amazing lineup of speakers. And you can RSVP by going to issues.org and clicking on events. And I just want to thank you all for making this such an interesting conversation today. Not only the panelists, but also the people in the audience, the chat, and the Q&A questions. This was just a really stimulating and interesting conversation. Thank you, Eleanor, for leading it. And we'll see you next time. Take care.